cloud. Okay, so we are recording. Please turn your camera off if you don't want to be videotaped. Okay, so again, welcome to the lecture for today's Under Construction lecture series installment. Just to recap and talk a little bit about the charge and what we're doing this semester. The charge of the Under Construction lecture series is to consider the areas of our discipline, our institution, our profession that really need attention, reconceiving, and reconstruction. We're trying to reify architecture through the lenses of how, why, for whom, and by whom, so we can understand the people, process, and politics behind the final image or the final rendering. And in doing so, we aim to illuminate the ideas, narratives, and concepts that will yield a world that is more inclusive, just, and considered. We're, as a school, very grateful to the Guy Lombardo Endowment Fund for funding this lecture and continuing to support public events and public learning. Just to recap and remind everyone about future events, this week we have Ife Vanable. Next week we have a lecture again on Wednesday, 4:30, October 28th. We have another lecture, and then on November 4th. Last week we had a hot take conversation with NOMAS and Professor Treva Ellison, which is available as a recording on the MAP website, so you can review that as well. One other reminder for all the students on the Zoom right now is that we have a virtual pizza event after this. So emulating the post-lecture pizza we usually get to enjoy together, we will have Zoom rooms with different faculty in them, and you're welcome to drop in, to chat and catch up, just like we would in a normal lecture setting over pizza, but this time we're gonna do it virtually via Zoom. So please come say hi to your faculty and catch up, let them know how you're doing. I'll put that link to the spreadsheet with all the Zoom rooms in the chat towards the end of the day today. And so we're going to kick off the lecture today. I'm gonna have Gesine introduce Ife, and then Ife, it's all yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So I'm very happy to introduce Ife Salema Vanable. She's an architect, theorist, and historian who holds professional and post-professional degrees in architecture from Cornell and Princeton universities. Ife is founder and leader of I Vanable, a New York-based architectural workshop and think tank. She's a visiting professor at the Irwin S. Channon School of Architecture of the Cooper Union and a PhD candidate in architectural history and theory at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. Her scholarly work asks questions of and seeks to unearth complex and seemingly banal relationships between the design of multifamily housing, municipal government machinations for its development, conceptions of racial difference, geography, finance, program, and family composition. Ife particularly studies Black subjectivity and dwelling in tall buildings, and the performance of domesticity and respectability, and the politics, aesthetics, and materiality of the making of home. Thank you for being here, Ife.
Thank you so much, Gesine. Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you for having me today. Thank you, Lindsay, so much for the invitation. I'm also holding a very small being. This is Raheem, about 2 months old, so he may be with us. I'm hoping that he will go back to sleep. He was sleeping all day, but now here he is. So I'll take it away. I'm going to share my screen. Oh, I see a few other small people there too on my screen, poking in. Okay. All right, can everyone see that well? Thank you so much. So just after 8 a.m. on an overcast Sunday morning on March 22nd, 1987, an 11-year-old girl, Duana, and her two older brothers, Robin, 16, and Stanley Jr., 22, jumped to their deaths from their 33rd floor apartment window of the South Tower of the Arthur A. Schaumburg Plaza Apartments, located at 5th Avenue and Central Park North in New York City, on an edge separating Central Park from East Harlem. The 3-bedroom apartment, shared with their parents, was ablaze. Trapped inside, driven by smoke, acrid fumes, and physically consumed by flames, left with little choice, the siblings sought refuge, a kind of freedom of sorts, from imminent death raging around them, in the air and space beyond the window. In a spectacular display of raw humanity and keen self-preservation, perhaps hoping to land on a downstairs neighbor's balcony, the children fell to their deaths amid screams from onlookers on the ground, imploring them not to jump. Urgings that may have had more to do with the spectators' desires not to be disturbed or haunted by the chilling sight of having witnessed the physical, material reality of bodies burned, flesh exposed, meeting the regularly traversed quotidian pavement, in an arresting public display of both fragility and nerve than anything else. As part of an inquiry into this devastating event, New York City Fire Commissioner at the time, Joseph Spinato, appointed by Mayor Ed Koch 5 years previous, observed the bodies were sufficiently burned to the point where it would cause people to opt to jump. Jumping from that 33rd floor apartment window and descending in flames, the bodies of the Jenkins children, bloodied, scorched, and blackened, unsettled and defiled the very firm boundary between private domesticity of their apartment up in the sky and the presumably public domain down and out on the street. The body of their mother, Martha Jenkins, a 43-year-old night nurse at Harlem Hospital, was later found in the apartment. Their father, Stanley Jenkins Sr., who was said to be driving a gypsy taxi cab when the fire struck, returned home unknowing and unaware of the tragic deaths of his wife and 3 children. Upstairs from the Jenkins family 33rd floor apartment unit, firefighters found the bodies of 3 other people burned to death in their beds in apartment 34H. The H apartment is directly adjacent to the trash compactor, which I'll talk through a little bit later. So according to Commissioner Spinato, the flames were confined to a few apartments that did not have smoke detectors, although he added that records had falsely indicated that the landlord had installed the devices. A preliminary investigation conducted by a special board of inquiry assembled by the Fire Department of New York revealed a series of falsifications, misinterpretations, discrepancies, deceptions, omissions, and outright lies about what was believed to have contributed to the fatal fire, including those attributed to flaws in construction and to confusion at the scene. The findings of the local FDNY were upheld and summarized in a federal report issued by the U.S. Fire Administration. The administration investigates selected major fires throughout the country that usually involve multiple deaths or a large loss of property. In its report, the USFA asserted almost 1/4 of the population of the United States lives in multifamily dwellings. Many of these are high-rises, and there are thus tens of millions of people who may be exposed to similar problems if the lessons from such fires are not heeded. Now, more than a cautionary tale, the brutal death of the members of the Jenkins family rendered visible with stark immediacy an otherwise slow-moving, casual, and common descent towards death that marks Black life, revealing the role racialization plays in the construction of modern humanity, of what it actually even means to be human, of the very idea of life itself. Striking in this instance is the exposure of how modes of architectural production and their accompanying protocols of maintenance and care are operative parts of the same project that has historically and continues to mutate to produce varying ideas about racial difference. and where value lies, about what matters. These alignments are not merely material, they constitute a discursive system, an aesthetic and socio-technical mode of operation that orders the world in particular ways. The story of housing in America is, to a certain extent, a tale of racial formation, an ongoing series of racial projects that have transformed and continue to transmute over time. Histories of housing are often narrated through two opposed lenses in this context. Public housing as a failed endeavor on one side, and the injustices, exclusions, and inequalities of suburban development. The narrative of housing and race has predominantly unfolded as a story of institutional subjugation, narrated in terms of dispossession, forced segregation, and discrimination. Blackness, as constructed in this narrative, is often conflated with conditions of impoverishment, and whiteness, typically unaddressed, taken as an unconsidered given, an unconscious universality. Mitchell Lama, the artifacts that these projects I'll be discussing today are a part of, a program for moderate income or middle income housing, is a product of culture, a socio-political, socio-cultural, and socio-spatial artifact, constructed as a result of historical processes that resonate in the present moment and endure into the future. And as such, architectural objects like these, buildings, spaces, urban territories, operate at both what I would argue a wholly undeniably material level, as well as at the level of the immaterial, an ethical, behavioral, affective mode of operation. Both the material and affective modes of operation of architectural artifacts maintain an ongoing and continually transforming aesthetics and attendant politics. Schaumburg Plaza Apartments, what it was known up until about 2005, when it was bought for nearly $1 billion and subsequently renamed the Heritage, is a part of a body of publicly funded and incentivized, although privately developed and managed, residential complex developed in New York. As I said, meant to provide affordable rental and both rental and cooperative housing for moderate and middle income families under what was called the 1955 New York State Limited Profit Housing Companies Law, known as Mitchell Lama after the Act's sponsors, New York State Senator McNeil Mitchell and Assemblyman Alfred Lama, many of which that continue to be developed under this program up until about 1980 are high-rises. Like Schaumburg Plaza itself. Harlem River Park Towers is another example of this in the Bronx. Tracy Towers in the Bronx, designed by Paul Rudolph at the end of his life. Lionel Hampton houses, designed by Max Bond, of Bond Writer at the time. Co-op City, one of the largest multifamily cooperative developments in the world. Bridge Apartments, developed over the overpass to the George Washington Bridge. Cadman Towers in Brooklyn, so on. This is a mapping of where the nearly 400 of these projects are built around New York, in the Bronx, Brooklyn, across Manhattan, across Queens, and even two in Staten Island. Instantiating motives for constructing a sort of urban, particularly Black middle classness, or what I like to say sort of dress up a population regarded as undesirable, pathological, in an architecture that would make them respectable. These developments were and continue to be deeply rooted in entanglements that engage, work on, and construct conceptions of race, ideas about the city's geography, and financial schemes. The design and physical material realization of this distinct body of urban architectural artifacts responded to the legislation's findings, which declared that the seriously inadequate supply of safe and sanitary dwelling accommodations for families and aged persons of low income were due in large measure to overcrowding, concentration of the population, improper planning, excessive land coverage, lack of proper light, air, space, improper sanitary facilities, and inadequate protection from fire. That these conditions be confronted with the provision of public monies, loaned, acquisition of private property as deemed necessary, use of eminent domain, cooperation between the state and its subdivisions, and tax exemption for these limited profit housing companies formed was deemed a necessity in the public interest, in the public good. The legislation and the institutional mechanism concocted mobilized various stakeholders to actually build Mitchell-Lama housing. These developments constitute social structures that are economic, political, and also spatial. And as such, these hybrid objects, not quite public, not quite private, can be understood as racial formations. Historically situated projects, I quote, in which human bodies and social structures are represented and organized. I'm borrowing this analytical tool from sociologists Michael Omi and Howard Renat, who describe a racial project as simultaneously an interpretation, a representation, or an explanation of racial dynamics, and an effort to reorganize and redistribute resources along particular racial lines. Racial projects connect what race means in a particular discursive practice, the terms upon which this practice is enacted, and the ways in which both spatial structures and everyday experiences are racially organized based on that meaning. So racial projects, in a sense, engage the inequalities that racial regimes produce, and as representational frameworks, as the work of culture, as well as other various forms of media like real estate brochures, which I'm showing now, produced in the 1960s and 70s, ahead of physical construction or completion, like these that boasted of tomorrow being today at Tilden Towers, or the height of value at the highest point in Manhattan for Inwood Tower in Manhattan. Nagel House, luxury you can afford in convenient, charming Inwood. Happy talk about the newest co-op hit. Photography of the time, like images produced by French magazines, for example. Photographers who visited 1970s New York City, Harlem in particular, for several weeks in what was then deemed forbidden Harlem. For the magazine Paris Match, a sort of weekly that at the time could be compared to something like Time Life magazine in the States. And even television. So the 1970s as well, this period in which projects like Schaumburg Plaza came into being, was dedicated in 1974. Shows like the Jeffersons, shows like Good Times. The Jeffersons was actually set in an actual New York City apartment building. It was the original context. It's a building on the Upper East Side at 85th Street. On the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of class and finance, there's Good Times, of course, initially set in Cabrini Green by the Chicago Housing Authority. And I can talk about these more in depth if there are questions about sort of analyses of these, but these forms of culture then involve these discursive practices, these terms used that make sense of racial difference in the everyday sort of banal, mundane modes of living. They infiltrate and construct the contours, contribute to the very idea of seemingly banal modes of Black, and in this case, very specifically, urban and middle class or middle income identity and domesticity. In this way, we can take the notion of racial projects even further, engaging what Alexander Weheliev's concept of racial assemblages describes as not any given natural or even cultural phenomenon, race that is, but an assemblage of forces that must continuously produce Black life as non or not quite human. As such, if racialization is understood not as a biological or cultural descriptor, but as a conglomerate of socio-political relations that discipline humanity into these full humans, not quite humans, or non-humans, then Blackness designates a changing system of unequal power structures that apportion and delimit which humans can lay claim to full human status and which humans cannot, and where the value lies in that status as a human being. The figure of the Black throughout the diaspora, and especially in what is referred to as the United States of America, and Blackness by extension, is a projection then in this way, an image, a fiction even. In The Door of No Return, the text by poet Dion Brand. She says the real and metaphoric, that the real and metaphoric as places as some places are, mythic to those of us who are scattered in the Americas today, is a place like the door of no return, that sort of window that the children jump through. To have one's belongings lodged in a metaphor is what she describes as a voluptuous intrigue. To inhabit a trope, to be a kind of fiction. To live in the Black diaspora, then, she thinks, is to live in a fiction, a creation of empires, and also a self-creation, operating on a dual register. It is to be living inside and outside of yourself. It is to apprehend the sign one makes, yet to be unable to escape it, except in radiant moments of ordinariness made like art. To be a fiction in search of its most resonant metaphor, then, is even more intriguing, end quote. And while the category and notion of whiteness as embedded in the narrative of the nation is equally fictionalized and co-constructed, what poet Fred Moten describes as the incalculably differentiated thing is the fetish character of Blackness and its open secret. Blackness as such is both magical and ordinary. It's rehearsed, constantly represented and practiced. It's embodied and structural. It's illusory and haptic. It's rendered common at both the level of the individual and the collective social body. Poet and scholar Fred Moten continues, Blackness is the name that has been assigned to difference in common. It's the ana-material inscription of common differentiation, which improvises through the distinction between logical structure and physical embodiment. And to him, physical embodiment is not, I quote, this or that skin color or bodily shape, but a haptic graph about touch, about the actual materiality of engaging the flesh. Logical structure is not this or that determined or determinate discursive frame, but a sort of common informality. So as racial projects, this complex body of high-rise residential towers that I study, sponsored by very well-crafted legal and financial maneuvers, are simultaneously abstractions and wholly real. These projections are deliberately engaged, not because of their centrality or authenticity, but because of their specific enactment of the marginality and the minority that is the central and authentic feature of Blackness, understood as a general, generative principle of differentiation. As Fred Moten explains, Blackness then is everything and perhaps nothing at all. One might ask, sometimes I ask myself, is Blackness even real? So Schaumburg Plaza is a high-rise, it's a multifamily residential complex, developed under the Mitchell-Lama legislation, but in coordination with what was developed as the Urban Development Corporation. Led at the time by Edward Logue, who was called the sort of master of urban renewal, the sort of king of urban renewal. The Urban Development Corporation was a private, public benefit corporation with a significant amount of public authority. Planned for a site at the northeast corner of Central Park for low to moderate income tenants, Schaumburg Plaza was developed also in coordination with private nonprofit committees. It was essentially acting on a requirement to involve community engagement. And this was the Committee for Central Park North. It's a demonstration of the community's participation in the project. And community participation in urban renewal projects was mandated through Model Cities legislation. This comes particularly as part of President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and War on Poverty initiatives. In this case, where architecture and architectural production, urban design, urban renewal is a part of that project that constitutes this Great Society. And that is an operative part in a so-called war on poverty. These initiatives, specifically part of the 1966 Demonstration Cities and Metropolitan Development Act, facilitated the creation of this Department of Urban Housing, Urban Development, which we now refer to as HUD, Housing and Urban Development. It also promoted experiments in alternative forms of municipal government, organization, and operation, leading to sort of support of programs like Mitchell-Lama. So the Urban Development Corporation was another one of these experiments by HUD a way to sort of endow a private corporation doing public work with a huge amount of authority to bypass perceived bureaucracy at the state level. So the founding was significantly impacted by the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at the time. The legislation was pushed through very quickly in 1968 and formed this very sort of powerful urban development corporation. Dr. Kenneth B. Clark, of the sort of Clark fame, part of the Brown versus Board of Education case, in which they presented the Dahl test. He's a sociologist, Dr. Kenneth B. Clark, he and his wife. His wife, Mamie Clark, was the first woman to receive a PhD at Columbia in sociology. The UDC, in an effort to comply with the mandate to represent the interests of the community and ensure participation where the residential projects were to be planned, formed nonprofit community organizations or coordinated with pre-existing groups in conjunction with development efforts. So in the case of Schaumburg Plaza, competing interests of a range of stakeholders, including Blacks from Central Harlem, East Harlem Puerto Ricans, who most aggressively displayed in the protests by young lords. That's how they're described, as aggressive. But these were usually very sort of well-organized and orchestrated protests against what they perceived to be a sort of middle-class Black invasion into their area, into East Harlem, where they had long lived and established a very robust community that exists today. Also involved were very deeply religious, heavily involved religious groups and others. They sort of troubled the monolithic conception of what constituted community in this particular area of the city and its geographic extents. Completed in 1975, the complex is comprised itself of 2 octagonal 35-story twin towers and an 11-story bar building that sits on top of this, that creates a sort of elevated plaza on top of a parking garage. They overlook Central Park at the Harlem Mirror. Both problematic and heroic, Schaumburg Plaza's design was a deliberate attempt to bring forth below market rate housing, aesthetically distanced from the looks of public housing projects, which predominates this area of East Harlem. Everything here in pink is a public housing, a New York City Housing Authority project. Schaumburg Plaza sits at the northeast corner of Central Park, right here, if you can see my cursor. Privately developed and managed, although supported by government funding schemes, these developments are indeed not public housing projects. So these looked like this as an aerial. Views from Schaumburg Plaza looking to the east, so looking here at Lehman Village homes, formerly James Madison's houses, here looking at Lehman Village again to the south from Schaumburg Plaza. Also in the vicinity are the Martin Luther King Jr. towers, Central Harlem. You can also see the Taft houses, Thomas Jefferson houses, Johnson houses. They sort of remain, though, distanced, that is Schaumburg Plaza, from the public housing projects aesthetics. But what they really aspire towards, according to Jordan Grusin of Grusin and Partners, architects of Schaumburg Plaza, in coordination with David Castroblanco of Castroblanco, that these buildings were really inspired by grand twin tower apartment buildings of Central Park West, like the El Dorado or the San Remo or the Majestic and the Century. And they, in many ways, Schaumburg Plaza was a sort of affront to the street. They were an affront to the sort of bold, everyday displays of domesticity, of passion, of sexuality enacted in public by Black and brown bodies out in the street. The ultimate development of the 600 units that make up Schaumburg Plaza of low to moderate income housing was initially crafted as a large-scale integrationist project, seeking to mix low-earning Black and Puerto Rican tenants with Black, white, and Asian moderate and middle income earners. In September 1973, before the project was completed and when applications were being distributed, nearly 6,000 people applied for the 600 available units. By 1974, there was another 4,000 applications received. So a deliberate and extensive advertising campaign was launched to reach beyond the glut of applications received from Blacks and Puerto Ricans. Management in the corporation led by the Clarks insisted that integration is a must if the development and community are to be stabilized. The redevelopment scheme was conceptualized and championed by the Committee for Central Park North, chaired by Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark, consisting of philanthropists, architects, realtors, economists, planners, and members of the surrounding community. The development was fundamentally founded on the premise that the spatial concentration of impoverished Black and brown bodies was inherently problematic, morally and aesthetically degenerative. The redevelopment scheme's aim was to render aesthetically pleasing a, quote, ugly, rundown, neglected, and dilapidated area, facilitating individual private domesticity and sexuality, performed in the homes of an integrated cohort of, quote, stable, clean, respectable nuclear families. The development in the end, as designed by Grusin and Partners, for whom in 1979, architecture critic Paul Goldberger coined the term Grusin country. For the spate of city municipal buildings they were responsible for designing. This included One Police Plaza, a sort of monumental red brick waffle iron of a building, he said, a striking departure from typical government architecture when it was completed in 1973, according to Goldberger. They also designed a sort of boldly sculptural Chatham Terrace towers in 1965, where, according to Goldberger, the play of light and shadow on concrete recalled the work of Le Corbusier, and the sinuous Chatham Green of 1961, a sort of slender slab of apartments in the form of a shallow S. A 2015 obituary to Jordan Grusin of Grusin Partners, the firm's founding partner, opined that the firm was not known for foreground architecture, the kind that attracts a critical attention in glossy publications. Rather, it goes on, they cultivated governmental, educational, and institutional clients that could provide decades worth of work. When that so-called work was housing, though, the sort of labors of living, of loving, of dwelling, the buildings do not necessarily constitute the foreground, and as such, they make up the background then. A sort of dominant trope that often can be found wafting through architecture school discourse at times about so-called background buildings. In many ways, these so-called background buildings amount to the common differentiation that Moten refers to, that haptic graph, dictating and determining where and how and which types of bodies are to be physically and materially housed where, positioning and delimiting the territory that extends and encloses those related behaviors. So the background is usually where all the stuff is, where all the life is, and where all the death is, where the blackness lies, where it is precisely everything, and as such, nothing at all. As Toni Morrison articulated in The Source of Self-Regard, the strange body, the legislated body, the body as home, in virtually all of these formations, whatever the terrain, race magnifies the matter that matters. So Schaumburg Plaza, at the cusp of Central Harlem, Harlem proper, and East Harlem, known as El Barrio, or Spanish Harlem, the area has long been contested, rife with competing social, political, economic, and racially motivated or aligned interests. What constitutes a community, as I said here, has always been fraught with conflict. So situated in this model cities and urban renewal development zone, an initial vision for the redevelopment was broached on New Year's Eve, almost 10 years earlier from when the project was completed in 1974. On New Year's Eve in 1964, Over lunch, assembled by Dr. Kenneth Clark and Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark, co-founders and director of the nearby North Side Center for Child Development. So in that small bar building that accompanies the twin octagonal towers is where the North Side Center, is where the North Side Center for Child Development is actually situated. So with a small group of architects, realtors, and friends, supposedly the project was discussed as an important venture for both the stability and progress of Northside and Harlem as a whole. So the sort of politics of convening this group of friends, of architects, of realtors, generated at that moment a single sketch, which is what I'm showing on the screen right now, by architect Edgar Tafel. It was a single bird's eye view of the redevelopment on the southeast corner of Harlem and the northeast corner of Central Park, known as Frawley Circle. The Clarks, champions of an integrated, multi-ethnic, multi-class development, began to gather political and economic support for what they regarded as a gateway to Harlem. But rather than a gateway, Frawley Circle site marked a stern, strict edge, demarcating where true Manhattan ended and where the others of Manhattan, its northern territories, began. The Clarks sought to transform that edge to architecturally facilitate mixing. A feature story in the World Telegram and the Sun announced the scheme would turn the area, now a pocket of decay, into a development for whites and Negroes in a kind of middle ground blending Harlem with downtown Manhattan. So led by Mamie Phipps Clark, the psychologist and director of Northside Center for Child Development, this is a Black woman of very sort of middle-class pedigree, who colleagues said her particular sense of the fitness of things permeated her entire being. The mission was to transform and redevelop the site on which Schaumburg Plaza would stand as an act of aesthetic reform and behavior modification in many ways. The Northside Center for Child Development then, through programming, services, and its commitment to environmental redevelopment, would then, in coordination with the Twin Towers, elevate the sensibilities of the Black child and the entire family, plagued by the degenerative ills of Harlem residents. According to a fact story, a center's 1968 statement of a dynamic direction for programming, the Northside Center could not be content with defining the goals of therapy in terms of mere adjustment or acceptance of an intolerable environment. As the children and parents grown in insight and developed strength of personality, self-confidence, and skills for effective functioning, according to the Northside Center's philosophy, they will demonstrate their new level of mental health by their concern for their fellow victims of the ghetto. Northside Center's concern for the actual living conditions of the total family, for what happens to the child in the classroom, for the conditions necessary for the presence of the father in the home, for the cleanliness of streets and tenements and other aesthetic reinforcements of human dignity in the home and neighborhood, all of this, according to the Northside Center, directly related to the capacity of a child to feel accepted as a human being and to function up the maximum of his creative potential. The Northside Center was adamant that the space of being and living was directly related then to the actual comportment of the child, to the well-being of the child. And that was at odds with what was perceived to be the ills of the ghetto. So this mission of the Northside Center sought to refashion and refigure then the Black subject through its social science apparatus of therapy and social services and through the deployment of appropriate and respectable architectural intervention. The figure of the Black in the urban domain is then extremely overdetermined, a subject formed by a particular knowledge apparatus, the sort of scientific tools of racial knowledge. So the Northside Center, as a site providing services, was involved in a deliberate and routine act of defining, naming, labeling, of which architecture was a fundamental operator. Rightfully so, as such an institution must clearly define the target of its services, of its intended recipients of care. Although as an instigator of architectural development, as a reformer operating on behalf of the welfare of the perceived disturbed hence pathological. The efforts of the Northside Center for Development as the Committee for Central Park North and later as the 110th Street Plaza Housing Development Corporation, in cahoots with the Urban Development Corporation, these huge conglomerates, what, as I mentioned, Alexander Wahelia describes as these agglomerations, were merely perpetuating a sort of fraud, in a way, one could say. This housing, which could be referred to as philanthropic housing of sorts, with its attendant supermarket, its elevated plaza, a new home for the Northside Center, which was typical of Mitchell-Lama projects, to include a mass of public programming with the residential projects itself, was in no way a gateway. Residents in the towers presented the image of a life not actually lived. Despite aspirational intent, where does one sort of move up to? It was merely housing. It was not an opportunity or a means to sort of getting your turn at bat, a la the Jeffersons, if you know the series theme, but a series of new apartments that sought to forge new Black bodies off the streets, reveling in private domesticity. So despite being up high, these remain but mere apartments, not opportunities for advancement, and perhaps reveals more about its advocates and their moralizing mission, seeking to usher in stable, respectable Black families, absorbed from the degenerative streets, than it actually says about the low, moderate income inhabitants who actually, in the end, paid the same rent they would have paid in the projects. Robin Evans, in the discussion of housing reformers, aptly articulates this. He says philanthropic housing was given shape by middle-class reformers and professionals who sought to remold the lower classes in their own recently crystallized image. Through housing, they could center the family within the ease and peace and comfort of a well-ordered home. Thus, they hoped to take life off the streets, out of public houses, places of amusement and nocturnal resorts, isolate it, parse it down, and boulderize it, till all uproariousness, passion, and violence were wrung out, end quote. So the identical octagonal floor plans of the twin Schaumburg Plaza towers, in the end, the North Sider, a sort of weekly chronicle by the North Side Community Center, got their gateway to Harlem as articulated by their own means. The identical floor plans of Schaumburg Plaza featured a very sort of compact central core with fire stairs and 3 elevators, sort of U-shaped corridor around the core, and 8 apartments on each floor. 3-bedroom units, 2-bedroom units, and 1-bedroom units. Constructed of poured-in-place concrete, the building was not required by code to have sprinklers, except for within the garbage compactor chute. The preliminary report issued by the Special Board of Inquiry, convened by the FDNY, regarding that March 1987 Schaumburg Plaza fire, found that inspections, though, of Schaumburg Plaza after its initial construction and during occupancy did not recognize that the compactor chute system in the lower floors of the building had never been connected or tested, and the system on floors 13 through 35 had clogged heads. Also, the valve which controlled water to the sprinkler head over the compactor in the basement was not open. Hence, no water was actually flowing, was unable to flow if a fire was to take place. Head of the board, Jonathan Fairbanks, revealed a firefighter who inspected the system 6 weeks before the fire mistakenly believed that the sprinkler system was functional. Upon inquiry by the New York Times, a spokesman for the company that managed the building, BSR Management of Manhattan, stood by the superintendent's report that the sprinkler system worked initially, but was somehow turned off during the fire. When the FDNY board interviewed then the superintendent, he unwaveringly stood by this account. The compact nature of that octagonal floor plan provided a particularly efficient and therefore cost-effective scheme. The compactor chute thus shared a room with a work sink, nudged into the fire stair, sharing a demising wall with the unit H. The FDNI Board of Inquiry report found that the approved building plans were not necessarily followed in the construction, and that the wall, if you can see here, the small sink and the actual compactor, the wall, demising wall between the unit H and the actual compactor chute was not built according to the plans for the building itself. The wall of the compactor chute had been approved in the plans at 3-inch thickness, but they were constructed at 2 inches. They were not fire-rated walls. Critical spaces were left open in constructing the pipe chase, for example, like in here. The problem did not come to light until the fire, they said. These discrepancies between approved drawings and actual construction led to the fire bursting through the walls and into the kitchens of at least 3 apartments in the building. The fire itself revealed several other notable tendencies and what could be referred to as so-called bias leanings, but amount to a more entrenched disregard for life. One that does not outright and immediately destroy life, but enables and sort of relishes almost in a slow but now mundane movement towards death. The fire occurred 10 years after, more than 10 years after the project was actually finished. It was a slow moving descent towards death. It's the work of not actively making live, but the very casual letting die, even in the midst of efforts that seem restorative, of providing for, like housing development, sort of demonstrated by seeming professionals called on to lend aid. An investigation by the Daily News claimed that the fire dispatchers had laughed off frantic calls from residents of Schaumburg Plaza. So in an effort to dispel the accusation, the FDNY released the tape recordings of conversations between fire dispatchers and callers to 911 on the morning of the fire. One operator, after hearing the distraught pleas from a resident, responded, "Hey, listen, lady, we know about it." Said to this woman on the 25th floor, who called for help and reported that smoke was filling her apartment. In a conversation that took place just 10 minutes before the Jenkins children jumped from their 33H apartment, a caller on the 15th floor described the fire and asked that more fire engines be sent to the scene, to which the dispatcher responded no and hung up the phone. The severity of the fire was grossly underestimated by the FDNY, its dispatchers, firefighters on the ground, one could say. According to the Board of Inquiry report, are humans who learn to expect certain types of problems in certain situations. That was how the report described the individuals who lived in the building. Humans who learn to expect certain types of problems in certain situations. The report concluded by advocating for more efficient public education programs, outlining 2 areas where education efforts should be addressed. The first that was deemed necessary to prohibit any such fires occurring was for residents of high-rises to be alerted to their common risk from fire and asked to report suspected fires. 2, since fires in the compactor chute are always the result of residents throwing in lit cigarettes and hot ashes, residents need to be taught that through such careless behavior, they not only endanger their own households and lives, but the property and people throughout the building, end quote. This is the FDNY recommendation for how these fires should be prevented. The low to moderate Black or brown resident of a high-rise residential development thus was found responsible due to a lack of common sense. That racially formed set of mores, standards, and aesthetic judgments deemed common. And by comparison, perhaps not actually entirely human, as they, unlike the firefighters, have not seemed to learn how to do and be better. So how the figure of the Black is constructed and housed in the socio-cultural imaginary impacts and is impacted by how that figure is scrutinized and evaluated served, deemed valuable through the course of social science endeavors, through public policy, through architectural production, all of which can be counted as architect in a sense, shadowy, consistently lurking in the background. The Schaumburg Plaza towers and others developed by the Urban Development Corporation, receiving finance by the Mitchell-Lama Housing Program, were also tall not as a result of architectural hubris or some desire to elevate the living conditions of low to moderate income Black and brown earners, but were rather preordained as such by public-private experiments and policy, impacted by objects of cultural production and social science endeavors, a sort of racial formation process. The high-rise residential tower is then what I would argue a racial project, an assemblage of processes, the physical manifestation of efforts to, quote, reorganize and redistribute resources along particular racial lines. As Paula Chakravarty and Denise De Silva assert, houses are unsettling hybrid structures. The house as a juridical, economic, and moral entity has even greater material as an asset, political as a dominion, and symbolic as shelter, authority, when agglomerated as high-rise, high-density, multifamily housing for urban Black bodies. Schemes deployed in service of this system to condition experience, delimit fields of action, and partition knowledge become things with which to think and act. Mitchell-Lama Housing then, as a state-fabricated and authorized and municipally elaborated scheme for housing Black bodies in the urban domain, embody these processes, making power relations explicit with logics not always merely reducible to that of capital or profit or mere discrimination. At this critical nexus, imaginative invention interacts with and complicates literal meaning, and where Blackness and the spaces deemed thereof are deemed without value, and to some extent, the state and the city is constantly reworked, redefined, and a new frontier reconstituted again and again and again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ife. And while Zoom doesn't allow for a kind of roaring round of applause, I'm sure we can sort of imagine what that would be with
Some hand claps.
There's some acting out of applause. So thank you very much for that. And I know we have at least one question in the chat. I'd love to field questions from everyone as well. So if you do want to ask a question, please raise your blue Zoom hand in the participants, or just type your question. And maybe we can start with Ariel's question in the chat. Ariel is in our planning department, and she says, I'll just read it for you, Ife. First, a huge thanks for this presentation. The analysis is so powerful, and I love the application of OMI and Winent. I'm curious about to what extent New York City as a case helps us understand public housing more broadly. It is an exceptional case in both volume of public housing management and in its design, given the morphology of New York City. How do you think about the ways that New York City sheds light on how public housing functions as a racial project? Does different morphology or design elements change how we think about that racial project, or how that racial project operates?
Thank you so much for that question. Thank you for recognizing Omi and Winant. And I would really encourage people to sort of read their text. It's Racial Formation in the United States. But I would also definitely encourage Alexander Wahelia's text, Habeas Viscus, that sort of takes their idea of racial project to a notion of racial assemblages, thinking about sort of socio-cultural, social-political assemblages, that it's a massive operations. One thing that I always find fascinating about New York, I'm a New Yorker, I'm from the Bronx myself. I grew up in a Mitchell-Lama housing project, actually a development. Is the extent to which New York was committed to its building stock. So where we see Cabrini Green, where we see many other cities, Chicago in particular, but St. Louis, many other cities, obviously, where demolition was deemed a legitimate resolve to what was perceived to be the inadequacies of public housing. New York is deeply connected and holds on to its building stock. There's not ever been a public housing project demolished in New York. And I think that there's something quite powerful about that. And there's something quite powerful about the narrative that surrounds public housing. What you'll often find are residents of public housing who say, well, we are hardworking people here merely trying to live like everyone else. And that in many instances, really quite like their apartments, don't like them not being maintained, which has to do with notions of of value rather, of where value lies and where life is to be cared for, where it's to be maintained. But I like this question of the morphology. It's something that I think a lot about in terms of form, in terms of what these floor plans look like, how buildings are actually articulated materially, physically, spatially. And I think this sort of, I've been writing papers on brick, for example, and red brick in particular in New York, that has a very sort of long history and lineage that goes to Hudson River common brick, developed in the region, which makes it very, very cost effective to build in brick the way that New York has built in brick. And the desire to distance itself, Mitchell-Lama housing that is, from the aesthetics of public housing projects was very deliberate. You had architects who actually said we need to make square bricks, for example, in order to very clearly aesthetically deviate from a perception of public housing that has to do with perceptions of the value of the bodies that live in those types of projects. That by aesthetically transforming them, you can also aesthetically transform then the beings, the bodies, the behaviors that exist within them. And as was mentioned in my bio, I am in the process of writing a dissertation, and my advisors are always asking me, what does New York tell us about the rest of the United States? What is it about the particularities of New York? It's holding on to its building stock. The prevalence of a program like Mitchell-Lama that literally developed almost 400 apartment buildings across the 5 boroughs, and a few in New York State. It's a state and municipal program. I think what it does is it begins to talk about the ways that New York is sort of committed to not this project of suburbanization, as is often sort of alluded to in this context, but a word that I like to use is sort of catchment. And the ways in which these processes that seem isolated, that seem segregated, are deeply intertwined. So while Omi and Wanat use this term racial project, Wahelia uses assemblage, I particularly like this word entanglement. It's a word that I've been thinking quite a bit about, and also desire. So in New York, many people who lived in Mitchell-Lama housing also acted as support. Many of the people who actually would be considered in COVID at this moment essential workers, bus drivers, public servants in many ways, bus drivers, postal workers. They occupied this middle income territory that really sort of maintained the sort of living domestic stock in these types of buildings. And that means that they need to be there. They need to stay there. They need to be provided for. And I think New York is a place where these entanglements are not always read, but are deeply entrenched. In other cities, the segregative mechanisms are so thoroughly wrought that then the sort of form of the projects begin to be attributed with the sort of deteriorating effects of the entire environment. Whereas in New York, it's sort of thick, entangled complexities. It's what I like to call these entanglements, this entrenched connection between these things that seem segregated, that seem isolated from one another, are so deeply needing of each other. They need one another. So this notion of catchment, of keeping the bodies present, is extremely important. Where you see in other places where experiments in public housing really sort of were able to easily translate into narratives about low rise, medium density housing, for example. There's a commitment to density that exists in New York that I think is really particularly interesting and challenging. It's something that I'm sort of still investigating about Why in New York, for example, does something like Mitchell-Lama happen? Why not Chicago? Why not Atlanta? Why not St. Louis? And it's an interesting project, I think, about how New York is interested in this sort of notion of catchment. Those bodies, those essential workers are necessary. They form the narrative about how New York presents itself. To be New York City, you need those bodies who can labor, and those laborers need to be housed. And you present something like Mitchell-Lama that then looks like it is an oasis. It's not the projects. I don't have to move out the city. There were people who literally said, I'm an apartment person. Tenants who said, I moved from a home to Mitchell-Lama because I wanted the apartment. Lo and behold, to not see it maintained over time. So that desire to have an apartment deemed new, deemed fresh, that desire is deeply tied to the sort of look of the state, these sort of new brutalist projects, many of which they are. You can kind of zoom back to some of them. Many of these sort of new brutalist Mitchell-Lama projects developed in the 70s. So it's something I'm still exploring and looking at and testing and figuring out.
I think one question in the chat directly sort of relates to that last idea of these objects, these oases. Cecily Bedwell said, thank you for the research and thoughtful digestion and dissemination of the issues. I'm wondering if your research looked at specifically the no man's land surrounding the high-rise public housing buildings and how this has added to the residents' disinvestment, and what your thoughts are on this built environment and its lasting impact. So the kind of expands the public space around the tower. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's really interesting in this case to differentiate Mitchell-Lama from public housing. So public housing is totally a New York City Housing Authority project. Mitchell-Lama receives public funding and incentives, but is privately managed and operated. So they're subsidized, which enables the rents to be fairly low. It's the Limited Profit Housing Companies Act. So these individual housing companies that develop these projects, they have to maintain low sort of profit limits in order to receive subsidies. Subsidies enable rents to stay low. But what you're reading, I think, and it's interesting also, the sort of idea of the tower in the park, I would say is a sort of first act in a narrative that speaks to projects like many of the New York City Housing Authority projects. They sit often in mega blocks and super blocks. They are typically isolated. One of the things I think that is still interesting about New York and East New York, East Harlem in particular, is the ways that the street does still sort of move through public housing. But one thing that's very, very interesting about Mitchell-Lama is that Mitchell-Lama, still operating as part of urban renewal, was able to take over sites once deemed industrial, for example. So this one that we're looking at right now, this is one I actually grew up in. This is Harlem River Park Towers. It sits right on the Harlem River, and it was designed in coordination with a school adjacent here and a state park, which is named for Roberto Clemente State Park. So oftentimes they were these bundled developments. But this was a former industrial zone. It sits on, if you can see here, there's a highway, which is Major Deacon Expressway, and there's also a sort of commuter rail line. Sits on the edge of that between the river and all of that bundle of infrastructure. And what Mitchell-Lama enabled was that for this notion of the public good, for public benefit, that these lands once deemed unusable for living were now deemed available for residential development. So they already sit on the outside edge of the infrastructure. They literally sit sandwiched in these very sort of isolated domains, these isolated territories. And it's interesting, I'm doing oral history work also with many residents, tenants in the building, resident activists. And many of them would say, driving on the infrastructure, I saw these projects and thought that they were amazing. And I wondered what it would be like to live in them. And today you see people looking at them and saying they're quite striking, but there's so many bodies. It's so many people stacked on top of one another. My dad, for example, has always had a problem with apartments. People are not meant to live on top of one another. But we often only say that when it's a certain type of person. We don't say anything about mega high towers for the rich to live in a high rise, to have a beautiful view. This one actually has a wonderful view of Yankee Stadium to the south. It's actually the tallest building in New York, in the Bronx, to the George Washington Bridge to the west. That there's something special that people feel who live on like the 43rd floor about being able to see out across the Bronx. But there is that isolation still nonetheless. And something I've been sort of simultaneously working on is something that I call deep segregation, this idea that there's sort of refuge in that isolation simultaneously while you are cut off. This is what we call in New York a two-fare zone, which means you have to take a train to a bus to get to this. There's always a sort of two modes of transportation that you have to take to get to this type of project. And there are these wonderful moments in the morning where you see tons of people getting off the bus and then tons of people, coming home. That dual existence, that isolation and that simultaneous refuge in your apartment that has purview over the city, I think dominates many of these projects. And in many ways, they do make their own territory. They create their own environments. They become their own ecosystems. This is a development that has, something like nearly, I'm trying to recall the number of actual apartments here. It's enormous. It's like 1,600 apartments here. It's something really, really dense, really staggering, the numbers of bodies that come up and down these elevators every day that are often broken, that you have to deal with that lack of care and maintenance. But this isolation, I think, it's a double bind in many ways. It's both a refuge. People love their apartments. They were designed by Davis Brody before Bond joined. And there are several projects of the same order by Davis Brody. There are another sort of mid-level architecture firm that I study quite closely that did many, many, many Mitchell-Lama projects across New York. So in many ways, I think it's a double bind. You have people who love their apartment. These have like 4-bedroom units. They're huge, they have big, beautiful windows, but they're nonetheless isolated in their own island at the same time. So there's a double bind.
I think that's such a good point you bring up too about the stacking of these and our perception of towers like this, and then all the Central Park South, luxury towers that, the highest sale prices for any condos in New York are also towers, and have a lot of overlap with the idea of views and being on top of the world, but geography, race, typology, materiality, all sort of come together around those two, so similar types of projects. Especially, whatever, we'll come back to that. So I want to take the next question from Danielle Ave. How do you think we can take major lessons of this presentation and make changes to the current planning practices in ways that provide more healthy, safety-conscious public housing or public-private housing, subsidized housing, workforce housing, or whatever you might want to call middle-income housing? You actually also, I'll come back to that too, I guess. You were differentiating between middle income and middle class, which I think is really important. So maybe that can be the next question that I would love to hear about. But for Danielle's question, basically, how can we take these lessons and improve health and safety practices for a building in general, whether it's subsidized or not?
Right. I think the first part, and I talk about this when I'm talking about this being a discursive system, and I think your attention to the sort of differentiation between middle income and middle class is really important in this sense, in terms of identifying the terms that begin to circulate around these types of projects. So I think the terms are really important. So I always think about Robin Evans when I think about this. So even when thinking healthy, safe, clean, that these words are entangled in rhetoric around what it means to be a decent body living in a decent home. That rhetoric already begins to speak about a particular idea about what it means to live and in what way. But then you have a very clear ethical responsibility as an architect. So I'm trained as an architect as well. I have degrees, like I was mentioned, professional degree in architecture from Cornell and a master's from Princeton, which is how I know Lindsay. As an architect, you must produce architectural objects that essentially are meant to maintain life, not enable it to, at some instance, have to jump beyond it away from a fire, for example. That you're meant to produce objects that are safe, that are clean, that do enable life to be led in a healthy, safe way. So I think that there's something amazing in many ways about these projects. I'm one who's also very much committed to imagination, to invention, to experimentation, and Mitchell Lama was a serious experiment. It was a serious imaginative scheme in many ways, scheming nonetheless, but it was very experimental and very, very bold and daring. And I think that there's something about that boldness, that daring, that I do long to see still. That I think there's a place for the sort of outsized nature of these projects. So often, many times people will say, well, they're out, Co-op City is another sort of very strange place that sort of created its own landscape. This was the tower in the park. This was a tabula rasa. It was literally built on swampland. It created its own site. There actually are reports of certain foundation areas on many of these towers that you can begin to see them beginning to sink a bit, former swampland. But I think that there's something in the daring still to be said for thinking about ideas for how bodies can be housed, how they can be inhabited in thoughtful ways that begin to think through materiality, that begin to think through morphology, that ask questions about floor planning. There's something kind of crazy and amazing about many of these floor plans, something that I'm looking at quite closely. And again, I do think about Robin Evans, and I think about figures, doors, and passageways, about these ideas about, a terminal bedroom. Why don't we have an enfilade where you can have a room that opens onto another room anymore? Why don't we have large open rooms? So even thinking about what makes up the component parts of an apartment itself, I think is still really important to not enable us. And I think that's one of the best lessons, to not allow ourselves to think about these things as givens, but that each of these components have histories, that there's that typical floor plan has been created, is designed, is not merely a function of mere use and ideas of clear, neutral notions of functionality. That terminating bedroom is about ideas about not being in the same room, having sex if you have children. Parents are meant to be separate in a separate bedroom. Children are not to be able to be in the same room with their parents. Bathing is to be isolated from cooking. Bathing is to be isolated from bedding. That those compartmentalizations, those divisions have histories. And I think that that's what these projects ask us to begin to test, to experiment, to evaluate, to assess what the standards are, what the sort of perceived ideas about functionality really mean when we're talking about actual meaning and living in domestic space. So I think that that is a fundamental lesson, is to continue to explore, continue to be bold, continue to take risks, and continue to ask questions of those things that are perceived to be standard.
I think that is such a important reminder too, in an academic setting and a research and design studio setting, and especially as things like health and safety, when that comes up, I feel like there's an inclination or a risk aversion that sort of goes to a default, so it is less innovative maybe and just goes by what is approved in the code and what is known and what is familiar. But that idea that you can be more healthful and more safe through radical experimentation and radical reconceiving, I think also is just right at the heart of what we're trying to talk about with under construction this semester, that we inherit all of these defaults and standards, and especially in actually building architecture, all these typical floor plans. Like that is an insane idea that we inherit this diagram of living and just take it at face value, and we're recreating someone else's values or values that have been put upon us, you know, over decades. And so I think that's such a great thing to think about, is how we can actually innovate in safety and reinvent. Because just, I mean, the whole presentation was about how the things that we're thinking are safe are actually passively letting people die. So if that's our standard of safety, I think innovation is called for. I was wondering, to go back to the middle class versus middle income, could you delaminate those and kind of, I mean, of course, language is so important and so fragile and fickle, and so those two seemed like you were really deliberately separating. So it'd be great if you could define how you use them.
Yeah. Part of it is specifically how the Mitchell-Lama legislation actually begins to talk about this. So the act was passed in 1955. The first projects were not actually constructed until somewhat later on. And they initially, about 10 years after the actual act passed, initially was written as housing for low to moderate income families. At this moment, they're not actually using the word class. And class at this time and today is something that is a deeply entrenched Marxist notion that oftentimes becomes sort of leveled on top of issues like this. So in Mitchell-Lama, they're speaking very, very specifically, very forcefully about income. They're talking about how much money is earned in a household. So again, when I'm speaking about a sort of discursive terrain, we're talking about terms that circulate around the origin, the development, the ongoing life of these projects. So in Mitchell-Lama housing, you apply and you have to submit an income statement. Every year, you're required to produce your tax returns. So the degree to which the state, the municipal government, is sort of invested in the household, is engaged in the household, what constitutes a household, is very, very deeply entrenched to how these projects live themselves over time. And that is very specific to this idea of just earnings, of income itself, where that then is determined by an area median, which can vary in various locations, which has led in many instances to Mitchell-Lama housing being accused of being subsidized housing for the wealthy. Because depending on where you live in a Mitchell-Lama, and there are very, very many Mitchell-Lama developments developed in Manhattan. There's one designed by Ife that actually houses students and faculty, part of a complex that houses students and faculty of NYU. One of the 3 buildings by Ife is a Mitchell-Lama subsidized tower. If the median income that determines what is the so-called middle income is relatively high based on its comparative region. If you're in the South Bronx, which there are few, but there are very, very many in Riverdale, which if you're familiar with New York, Riverdale is a sort of enclave of the Bronx. Sometimes you can't tell those people that they live in the Bronx because it's Riverdale. It's got a certain cachet, has a very, very high income. So to live in a Mitchell-Lama there, you can be fairly well to do. And there have been lawsuits. As you can tell, my work really looks at legality, looks at law, policy, practice. So there are very many lawsuits about how Mitchell-Lama actually doesn't serve those who it was intended to serve. Class, on the other hand, and I just defended my prospectus, and my advisors were asking me the same exact thing, begin to isolate and begin to parse out the differentiation between the terms, but also implicate them in the sort of forming of each other. So class, as we're beginning to think about a sort of identity, a sort of culture of behavior, a sort of mode of being, I think is much more attributed to these notions of class. And I would say then, for me, that makes it even more fictionalized. Class is something that I would say, like Blackness, I would say like race, is something that is constantly constructed. And the idea of the middle class itself is something that's extremely deliberately and carefully constructed over time. It's something that some would say doesn't even exist, is just constantly being made and remade. David Roediger has a great new book, I actually need to read it, just came out, called The Sinking Middle Class, about how the middle class is essentially formed, is crafted, is created, about the house that means, about the income that means, about the family composition that means, about how that is a sort of series of behaviors, values, desires that are defined and redefined and constantly under work, under construction. So I would say that's very much the difference about that sort of fictionalized entity and one that's very firmly based on actual earning and income. But the interesting thing about Mitchell Lama is that you have people like trying to dodge the system. You know, they'll say certain people are not on a lease. If you're not on the lease, then you do not need to actually have to divulge those very private income statements. There were lawsuits about that as an invasion of privacy, obviously. So there are ways in which freedoms are sort of garnered within that system that is so sort of pervasive, so deeply entrenched in your household. How do you begin to skirt it? And so those are some of the other things I look at in terms of how people have sort of skirted those things as well.
All right. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense in terms of something that's quantifiable and something that's maybe not even definable in a kind of static way. Mm-hmm. And still how there's fictions around what we think is fact.
Right.
Okay, so maybe quickly we can just touch on the last two questions. Hetty Lee asked a question. I'm not sure maybe if they are still, or if she is still on the line, maybe she can elaborate, but she asked a question about, interested to learn how intimacies connect to your idea of entanglements. I'm not sure exactly, Hetty, what.
Is this Hetty I know?
Is this a
Hetty,
Hetty Lee?
Mm-hmm. This could be a Hetty I know. I don't know. I don't see.
Well, anyway, maybe you can wrap that into Juanita's question, which has a lot of context. And Hetty, if you are just having trouble unmuting, you can jump on in a minute. But sort of wrapping up with Juanita's question, I found the images of people living life outside juxtaposed with the notion of people being off the street and neat and tidy, unsettling. How can we as architects and designers, as people very attuned to aesthetic logical organization, navigate the intersection of values when we're considering who we are designing for?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Sort of a broad, projective, state of discipline kind of question. Thanks, Juanita.
I know, thank you. Juanita is my grandmother's name. I always love that name. So part of this is very multi-layered, is also domesticity. I'm sort of really, really super interested in just the space of the home itself. The sort of, I mean, I'm writing a paper on like plastic covers on sofas because I just think there's something about these sort of small material gestures, like in this image, a towel hanging on a hanger, you know, in the living room, and those layered modes of being, of living, of being together, the small things that populate the home, the intimacies of that life and of the way people order and organize their homes, I think is very sort of deeply connected to this work that I do. It's something that I'm just sort of obsessed with in a way also. And I think that sort of intimacy is something that's really important to me. So I'm glad that you caught that distinction between the sort of life out on the street bodies and being in the street, and the sort of tidiness of the perceived, also, I mean, even in the compactness of the geometries. Something about Mitchell-Lama that I always find quite striking also are the compactness of the geometries. The floor plans are very, very tight. For all the architects you know about floor plan efficiencies, Mitchell-Lama has very, very high efficiencies. I had to do very many floor plans, often for cooperative or condominium projects where developers want to know what's the efficiency of the floor plate. And Mitchell-Lama projects are so compact, they're so dense, they're so tightly filled. The rooms can be sometimes very generous, but there's this very thick compactness in a sense. And I always work in like contradictory terms, so like the thick compactness. But the life out on the street, and I look at Mitchell-Lama predominantly built in the 70s. Many of the very, very high towers were developed in the 70s, and that has a lot to do with also urban planning policy. In the 60s, rezoning of New York, they enabled benefits and grants to developers who developed more compact floor plates. If you had more open area on your site, you were given credits. So there's already in planning policy ways to incentivize building high. So that's part of what I mentioned when I'm saying these are sort of shadow architects in a way. These policies that begin to already predetermine and dictate what the overall envelope of a building will be. But I think that these intimacies are really, really important. And I think one of the ways to sort of think about that as a designer who's designing for bodies, and especially in this moment when we say a so-called white person needs to be clear and critical about how they're designing for a so-called Black person. But when we're doing that, we're already differentiating in a way that is creating those differences. We're already saying that there's something inherently different about that Black being, about that Black body that we need to know something about in order to do this properly. Rather than saying, how do people live? How do people organize the space of their home? How do people cook in a kitchen? How do people use a restroom? Now, someone like Wahelia would also say that obviously Blackness is still important, that there are still differences in the ways that maybe some Black people actually do things. So how do you navigate this liminal terrain of being respectful of the human being, as a person who lives a life like any other life, but then also recognizes difference? And I think for me, the key is always to not be afraid to recognize difference. That part of what architecture has done is created a sort of universalizing subject. We just say all people are people, all bodies are bodies, that there's a universal man. And this also hints at work from scholars like Sylvia Wynter, people who look at what it means to be a person, but how a human being is formed and how man is formed. Man as a universal subject. And I think that that's part of what we need to allow ourselves to divorce ourselves from as designers, that there is no universal. Be able to see difference. That means then asking questions. One of my colleagues who teaches at Cornell right now does a studio on public housing projects in Brooklyn, and public housing projects are the site. So they're not creating new public housing units, that's the site of intervention. And one of the first things they do are go out and talk to people. They go to the library, they go to the park, and they just start talking to people. They just start talking to people about desire, talking to people about where they want to live, what the space of their apartment should look like in their minds. And I think we're so afraid to just recognize difference, to call out difference, that we need to be able to see it. We need to be able to not be afraid to recognize that differentiation, particularizing can be simultaneously beautiful, as problematic as it can also be. It's a very challenging liminal terrain. You're always on a limit. But I think it's foremost to not be afraid to recognize difference and ask questions, to be someone who is openly interrogating all the time. And I see my work as always sort of interrogative. It's always asking questions constantly and trying to see things that I thought I already knew or thought I already understood. And I think that's the biggest thing, is to those two things, to really not be afraid to see difference, to recognize difference, and to simultaneously ask questions. In that, obviously, you must be thoughtful, you must be sort of careful, but I think to be fearlessly asking questions and to be unapologetically recognizing that there are differences is really, really important. To say that a so-called Black person must have some, or a low-income person, which often becomes a sort of, a way to disguise speaking about Blackness, to say it's low income, you're already beginning to fold into a series of narratives that need to be deconstructed. So I think being able to open those things up, to ask questions, to recognize difference in a meaningful way is really, really important.
Thank you so much, Ife, for
Having me
today. That was, I think, a fantastic reflection to end on.
Thank you.
So, of course, we could talk about all these issues forever.
I can talk about this stuff forever.
Well, we'll have you back to talk about it another time. Thank you again for your thoughts, your images, your research, and spending time with us. And we'll have to have you back for something in the near future.
Please have me back.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And I think a collective, virtual round of applause is appropriate. So we'll catch up sometime soon. And I'm going to